is Ebenezer Safford. I'm a business strategy consultant and a data specialist. Welcome to part 2 of my interview with Brian Julius. If you've not watched the part 1, kindly click on the button above so that you could get it and appreciate Brian. Brian has over 30 years experience in working with data. He is a trained economist who now works primarily with data and trying to help others navigate their path into data. Today, we are going to focus mainly on how to derive value in data with data in organizations. There's a buzzword all around about data insights, data-driven decision-making, different jargons and different technologies being thrown about in there to help companies or organizations not get around with these bars and rather make the best out of it. I have Brian here to help us navigate journeys of organizations and how best practices in how to derive value in data. So welcome again, Brian.
Thanks, Ebenezer. Great to be here.
All right. So Brian, you've been working with data for over 30 years. What are some of the pitfalls that you saw in your work as first a developer? You've also managed several data projects and actually also managed people to carry out data analysis or data science projects. So what are some of the pitfalls that you would say you would not do again if you were to start all over again?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've learned a lot in terms of kind of school of hard knocks of, things that didn't work and, trying to redo those in a way that doesn't fall into the same traps. And, I think one of the biggest things that is both an advantage and a potential pitfall in any sort of data project, but particularly ones like, with using tools like Excel and Power BI that are kind of highly accessible to the business user, is that there was a phrase coined by a friend of mine at P3, and he called it the Excel debt service. And he said, that the companies just keep having to pay that Excel debt service year after year, which is they've got all these spreadsheets, dozens or even hundreds of spreadsheets developed by different users using no consistent methodology, linked in all sorts of haphazard ways. And, the individual analyses may be excellent, but there's no rhyme or reason to kind of how many of these were developed. They were just kind of done as individual projects that became useful. And I think Power BI, one of the strengths of Power BI is that it can put really incredibly powerful tools in the hands of business users and people with that domain knowledge without having to have them be expert programmers or IT, professionals. But the problem in that is that you can basically end up replicating that same Excel debt service. So you've got reports that look different, that behave differently, that access different versions of the same data. And so, I think when you implement any sort of system, whether it's, Power BI or, any other tool, you've got to have a strong governance function, which lays out, what are the single sources of truth in data? How are people going to access those? Who's going to have access to them? Who has the rights to develop reports? Who has the rights to change a report that's been developed? All the questions of, in Power BI, for example, what are the settings you're going to apply in the service? Are you going to allow publish to web? Are you going to promote, certain data sets as certified? Are you going to use data flows and the new data mart, capabilities in order to, kind of make more efficient the process and kind of more consistent the information used? So I think, probably the biggest pitfall is letting smart, creative users just go off on their own and do smart, creative things. I think you want to do that, and you want to take advantage of that innovation and that expertise, but in a smart way that allows for kind of consistency and efficiency and um, manageability, scalability, yeah, all those things, rather than just kind of letting it grow haphazardly, much the way Excel did, I think, in many organizations.
Wow. I believe that what Brian is saying, that in as much as individual brilliance is important that in scaling the use of business intelligence or the use of insights in an organization, there needs to be some governance model right from the word go to help actually bring everything to a certain level of consistency, because you're not trying to look at a one-off attempt, but you're trying to see an organizational value in what you are trying to do. All right. So with the governance in place, what are the other things you think the organizations should look out for in implementing data projects in a wide scale?
I think the most important thing in terms of having data projects really produce value for the organization is to have the people developing the reports and governing the systems really talking to the business users and saying kind of don't talk about reports, don't talk about tools, don't talk about technology, talk about where are the pain points in your job. What are the things, one of the things I like to think about is I have a kind of a mental model that I use called the magic box, which is when you're talking to users, ask them if you had a magic box that can answer any question about your data, and don't think about whether you think it's feasible to answer that question or not. The magic box can answer anything. What are the questions you would ask? And so what are the things you want to know that you currently don't know or can't know based on the data and tools you're using? And the interesting thing about that is that it gets people out of thinking about, okay, like I want something that's like an Excel pivot table. There's a great quote that, from from I think it was Henry Ford that said, if I ask my customers what they, if I asked my potential customers what they wanted, they would tell me they didn't want a car, they wanted a faster horse. It's because they have no basis necessarily to say, what is it that they want? And an analogy I use is that, if you start talking about technology and reports, it's like asking somebody in the 1800s, how do you want your private jet configured? And they just have no reference point to answer that question, because it's a technology that they're not necessarily familiar with, and nor should they be. That really it comes down to what are the business problems that they're struggling with, and how can you apply the technologies at hand to solve those problems. And so, two examples from my experience are when we talk to users, what they said was HR is a huge pain point. That every time a manager wanted to know, we'd have 20, 30 HR actions in process at the same time. And anytime a manager wanted to know what the status of an action was, and in the government, hiring is like a 40-step process. And, each step has a certain number of days and is done by a particular individual. And if they wanted to know where something was in the process, they would have to call one of our HR specialists in the office and say, okay, I want to know about this position. Where does this stand, status wise? And that's hugely inefficient, because it may be that that person's out for the day or that person's in a meeting. By the time they get the request, it takes them a while to search for it. They've got to then send that information back. And it's a crazy use of people's time to be doing it that way when all that information should be available in a centralized system. And so, what we did is we talked to folks and they said, we're not getting the manager's saying, we're not getting timely information. And the HR specialist saying, we're spending all our days looking up information for the managers. And so both groups are saying, hey, here's a problem we have that can easily be solved by, a tool like Power BI. You've got that central HR database. You can put the status tracking directly in the hands of the managers and in the hands of the specialists by just, a basic report with some slicers and some filters and a date slider. And it can make that question, what is now potentially a couple of days of back and forth, or at least a few hours, it can turn that into 15 seconds and take that completely off the page of something that the HR specialists have to worry about. And they can then take and apply their time to more impactful tasks. And the other thing we learned in doing that was some of the divisions would say, hey, we think our HR actions are being processed slower than the other divisions. And we can say, okay, that's your perception. Is that true? And then if it's true, why is it true? And what we did is we broke down that analysis and said, yeah, it is true. Your actions are taking longer. And the reason is because your managers are slower in responding to the parts of the process that they need to respond to than the managers in the other division. So yes, it's true, your actions are going slower, but that's entirely within your control. And that's the sort of thing that you often can't get without kind of that analytic focus on the data, because it's not apparent just from talking anecdotally to people. And the other thing I would say in terms of extracting value is you really need to do testing with your users. That I think as a Power BI developer, I think one of the things I've learned is that we as developers are so comfortable with the tools that we just assume a level of knowledge by the users that doesn't exist. And I make this mistake myself. I've made it time and time again. And what I saw, and I don't know if you happen to see the session that was run during the most recent data visualization summit that we did, but there was a woman named Kristen Pfeifferlich who did. She's a UX specialist with Oracle, and she did a brilliant session on testing. And what she showed, she took a report that had been developed in one of our challenges. It was actually the winning report in our challenge, our data challenge, and it was a great report in terms of analytic capability, in terms of navigation. But the interesting thing is it hadn't been tested, as you wouldn't expect it to be in a data challenge. But when we tested it actually with the clients for whom it would have been developed, and these are people with PhDs and extensive domain knowledge, they broke that report in ways we didn't ever expect. And they would run into problems where they would try to find something and they would put a bunch of slicers and filters on and then not be able to clear the slicers and filters. And it's the type of thing that we as developers, we know how to do instinctively, and we just do it in our sleep. And so you don't ever assume that somebody's going to run into a situation where they're like, I can't clear this. And there was another case where they broke the report in a way. I was watching it and I was like, in a million years, I never would have broken the report that way, because it was a sequence of clicks that I would know enough not to ever make. But somebody who is a domain expert, but not a Power BI expert, it would be very logical for them to make those set of clicks. And so you can develop a really fantastic analytic report, but if you're not testing it on the users who are actually going to be the clients for it, you may find that report is not as valuable and useful as you think, because it ends up being quite frustrating, even if you think it's very clear. And that was a big lesson for us. And I think if you watch that session, it's interesting because Kristen, actually, we did some taped user testing, and she actually shows excerpts from the user testing sessions, and it shows exactly how the users go wrong, and very, very insightful. And so I think,
Which session was that?
It was one on user experience testing. I I can pull that up if you want, and I can give you the exact name on that one. Hang on just one sec. Yeah, let me find you the I'll send you after this interview the citation for that one, because I think it is remarkably valuable and insightful. And it's one of those things that I think as developers, it's a very easy trap for us to fall into, of just assuming our users have more knowledge about the tool than they do.
I think that this is a very useful tip that you've given us, that at the end of the day, from what I gather from the two main tips that you've talked about as things to consider, all has to do with the user being at the center of development, or at the center of every data project, in the sense that if companies want to derive value from data, it always has to start with a pain point, and also considering the users. At the end of the day, after you are not just answering the pain point, but you are answering it in a manner that is user friendly for the user, so that you could actually ensure consistency in use of the report for the decision making. So these are two great ways to actually bring value to your data projects. Always start from the business pain point. Don't just start any project. Find out what the pain points are. Don't think that because you've learned one technique or the other, it would be useful to your organization. Always go back to the users and find out from them what are their pain points. And he said, quoting Henry Ford, that if you are just giving them just on the technology side, the questions on the technology side, they are likely not to even know what questions you need to ask, or they need to ask. Ask from them the problems that they are facing, their pains, and then you now model it in the technological way and see how best you can use your Power BI or your tool to solve the question. And the second thing that he's talking about is make sure that it's user friendly. It's something that technical people always overlook, that so far as my solution is okay, and I'm okay with it, and I've spent so much time and it's so sophisticated, the user should be able to understand the use. At the end of the day, this is not going to be, dashboards and reports are not necessarily PowerPoint presentations where you take the person through. It's always going to be with the user. Just like any app that a person has downloaded offline or online, just like LinkedIn. If I don't know how to use it, by being it instinctive, then you are making it challenging for several people to use. Nobody taught us how to use LinkedIn or Google search per se, but it becomes as intuitive to everybody on all social media platforms, and people start using it. And that is how you think through with the user, so that it ensures that the user can always look out for ways that they can use your reports. Thank you very much on that, Brian.
Sure.
So with that in place, what other things do you think that we need to consider to derive value from our data projects or our reports that we're building for the organization?
You know, I think there's, I'm just making some notes here of things I definitely want to cover. You know, one of the things that is become very convincing to me, and is really the idea of standardization in reports. You know, that I think you can, particularly if you've got multiple divisions and multiple developers in an organization, you can get kind of this crazy patchwork of, you know, individual preferences and styles. And, you know, some people will say, well, that's creativity and you're benefiting from that. I don't I don't actually believe that. I've become a real believer in the standardization and the value of that. And so I think, if you listen to Ralph Hickert and Jürgen Feist from IBCS, International Business Communication Standards, I think they make an incredibly compelling argument that for business reporting, having standard nomenclature and standard reporting techniques and visualization approaches, kind of focusing on things like the use of variances, and denoting those variances in a very standardized way with colors. I think they talk about solid outline hatched, and what each of those patterns means in terms of actual, previous, and forecast. And to me, it's like, I mean, some folks say, well, those reports look boring, but I think their point is, do stop signs look boring? Do musical notes look boring? It's not about creative or boring. It's what you do with that symbology. And I think you can be creative in the analytics, but have that presented in a way that no matter who you are or what the context is, you intuitively understand what those visuals mean. And I have become a real convert to that. That when I first heard it, I thought, oh, that limits creativity and it's really restrictive. And now I really believe that to derive the full value from your data projects, that particularly in kind of financial and business data, that having that level of standardization along the lines of a series of standards that are proven, that are internationally accepted, I think is an immediate way to increase the value of your data.
So one thing is standardization. So in as much as you want to be creative and innovative, create some standardization so that it's easier on users as well as developers. I'm sure that increases even the speed in which reports are built, and as well as it's easy on the user that any report that I get, I can be able to interpret, irrespective of where it's coming from in the organization.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's like, now I can look at those reports and just immediately find what I'm looking for. At a glance, I know exactly what it's telling me. And I think there's tremendous value in that. And I think also just from a development standpoint, as you say, it's much faster to develop when you're developing according to standards. And so you win at both the development side, the interpretation side, and the insight, the actionable insight side of things. So I think that's one. I think maintenance and documentation is another huge area, and I think none of us like doing it, but it provides enormous value because one of my colleagues, Greg Phillips, who's been a consultant for years and is one of the top experts that I know in this field. He talks about the fact that it's very rare that you have a report that is managed by the same individual over its entire lifespan. And so you as a developer are probably going to be passing that report on to somebody else. It may very well be that in your governance structure, you develop the report, and then the person on the IT side is responsible for administering and maintaining that report. But it's very rare that you're going to carry that report cradle to grave. And so with that in mind, you've got to have a way to clearly transition that report from you to somebody else. And there are a lot of ways to do that. Some of which is building the reports in a standardized way and being standard in your data modeling approaches, adhering to the star schema approach, building reports with, kind of a common visual language, having clear standards in terms of documentation, commenting of your code. I think there are some outstanding documentation tools, and there are three that I use. There's the DataMark Documenter 2, which Mark Layfeld on I can't remember what organization he's from, but he's an MVP and has done a lot of development for the Power BI community and has a free documentation tool that is outstanding. Imke Feldman has one called the Power BI Gen 2 Cleaner, which is one that is used to determine whether or not you've got unused fields and measures in your report, and to kind of strip the report down to only what's needed. And then Ken Poles has a set of tools called Monkey Tools that is incredibly useful for both performance optimization and also documentation. It's probably got the most comprehensive documentation module of any tool that I use. And those, as well as a tool I actually just talked about last night on LinkedIn by Michael Kowalski, which is the report analyzer. And I think the combination of those four tools really help kind of strip your report down to the essentials, make sure that it runs fast, and also provide a really clear path for documenting that report in a clear and concise way that helps you transition that to somebody else. So there are great tools out in the community for doing that, and I think if you incorporate the use of those tools into your governance processes, I think it's going to leave you in a much better situation where you don't have somebody leaving the organization who's worked, for 3 years on a set of reports, and they leave and everybody else is like, I don't know how these reports work. They're critically important, and I don't know how to maintain them. You're not gonna run into that problem. So that's one that I think is essential. And as I say, it's kind of a task that nobody really likes. I don't know anybody who's really excited about documenting their reports, but it's so essential, and I think it's one that shouldn't be overlooked. And I think one of the other things is having champions in your data process. And what I mean by that is people who are really articulate and passionate about what data analysis can do for an organization, and be able to talk in a really plain language, convincing way to the whole range of audiences that they're going to need to convince, whether that's the technical users, whether that's the middle managers, the senior managers, the IT security teams, the CIO, the CIO, kind of that person who's the hub, who can be the coordinator and maybe doesn't know as much about any of the particular areas as the most knowledgeable person in each of those areas, but knows more about every area than everybody else, and can kind of be that connector and that person who is the translator and the kind of motivating force behind the data, kind of the advancement of data analysis in an organization. And I think the really successful organizations that I see, you can identify that champion very clearly, in terms of somebody, as I say, who's passionate, who's skilled, who is credible, who has kind of the respect of everybody in the different corners that you're going to need to coordinate. And I think that is essential. And then making sure that champion has senior management support, so that when they say, I've got a commitment from management to do this, they've got budget allocated, they've got staff that they need, they've got the approval for, to use the technologies that are going to be needed. And I think that combination of that powerful champion combined with executive support, I think you can accomplish an enormous amount in an organization with that.
Because I was about to ask about on that, you know, some organizations, in some few consulting that I do, one problem I see is the executive management trying to just buy time or trying to just not lose out, not necessarily seeing value. So my question would have been, how do you ensure that the executive management get an appreciation of what these data projects are? And like, so how do you combine this with a champion to get, perhaps most of the time you see maybe the CIO in support of this, but the various core business units, i.e. sales, marketing, finance, administration, not probably getting the full understanding of what these projects or what the benefits of these projects are. How do you go about such ways to ensure that the company derive value?
Yeah, that's a great question. That is a great question. I think if you ask 10 people, you'll get 10 different strategies on this. But the one that I've used is I'm very much kind of an incrementalist in these sorts of things, that I'm more start small and build up. And I think what you need to do is you need to find your early adopters among the executive support. You know, those people who really maybe have a technical background. And I know in my case, the executive sponsor for my biggest project was a former economist as well, and a very strong data analyst, and you know, somebody who, like myself, had, you know, kind of come up through the ranks in the data field and then moved into senior management. And so I knew that he was somebody who would understand what we were doing and why we were doing it. And he was at a level and a point in the organization where he had, you know, tremendous authority and credibility with the organization, and at the same time an understanding of the technical. So my strategy was, let's start with him. You know, here's a guy who gets it, and he's very influential and has a lot of gravitas. And let's build something, not necessarily something huge, but something that attacks a pain point and does it in a really effective way. And it may be relatively small. You know, we started actually with the HR problem I talked about, and we built that out. And for the people who are kind of inherently more skeptical or don't necessarily have that background, it's hard sometimes for them, if you talk in conceptual terms, for them to understand what it is you're really getting at. But if you can show them, say, okay, here's a problem we had, and here's, you know, put it up on screen and show a very practical example of, here's how you can take and use this tool to answer questions that would normally take you, you know, 2 days to answer, and I can answer this in 15 seconds. Then you've got something. And then you can leverage off of that, you know, kind of incremental success, and then say, okay, here's how we can take, you know, that from HR and move it into supply chain, or take it from supply chain and move it into finance, or, you know, from finance into, you know, whatever the, you know, the next, you know, business unit that needs to adopt this is. But I think, you know, one of the mistakes that I see people making is trying to do too much too fast. It's kind of like what we talked about in part one of the interview, that it's the organizational equivalent of the Power BI user who gets excited and tries to learn everything all at once over a weekend. You can't do it. And I think it's the same thing organizationally, that if you bite off too much, you're going to fail. And if you fail, the people who are skeptical and the people who are uncertain are going to say, yep, you see, we tried it and it didn't work. And whereas I think if you move slower and you move incrementally and carefully, and you build off of your champions and your early adopters, that you can steadily build up larger and larger, more and more difficult, and into those more skeptical users, and convince them thoroughly. Whereas if you just take too big a leap initially, you really put the whole thing at risk.
I mean, your comment right now is making me rethink about some mistakes I've made in the past concerning some works I've done. Like the issue being that you need to be incremental about the usage of data and data-driven decision making. Like you're saying, you have to start with the knowns that you already make these decisions. However, it may take you a day or two to get these reports before you take a decision on them. So why don't I help you do this decision rapidly on the go, perhaps at any point in time, and it reduces the time to pull up a report as well as reduces the time in taking the decision. This is something that any level-headed person would agree with you. And you start from there, nothing fancy, nothing too big. And it comes back to the first point that you made, that if you are looking at it at the business pain point, for instance, let's say I'm in an organization and I want to help my marketing team to actually adopt this. The first question probably I need to look at is to ask what are their pain points. Perhaps all that they are looking for is how many customers have I talked to and how many am I able to convert to real customers. That's what they are interested. They are not more interested in probably your techniques that you've learned, all the big techniques and the big codes that you've learned. These are questions they answer daily. And if you're able to help them see through that perhaps my funnel is getting bigger at the top and I'm not getting so much leads, or I'm not turning so much of my customers in my leads into customers, then that becomes easier for them to adopt than you just trying to get everything at once and all the fancy things that you could probably do with your analysis. So I believe that what you just said is one of the takers, that start slow and incrementally and look at what hurts them the most and how quickly you can solve that for them. And that is something that everybody will be willing to go with you. And you talked about the champion, that you could go to the champion, like people that have same understanding as you or have similar backgrounds as you and are likely to appreciate what solution you have for them because they've already been in your shoes before, and they are likely to drive it at their point, and then you get other early adopters and late bloomers as you go on. So these are very useful tools for useful tips for companies to derive value. Like learners, like you said, don't think that you can learn everything at a go. So as a company or as a business, you cannot get it all right at a go. Just start small, but make sure that you're incremental about it and celebrate the successes. And then you can actually move from there.
Yeah, I think that celebrating the success is essential, and I think that sometimes gets overlooked. That I think when you finish a project, I don't know, you're probably this way too, but there's such a relief at finishing it and kind of getting it successfully launched that you're kind of like, okay, on to the next one, and sometimes you don't always take time to both appreciate and also to monitor, because it sometimes kind of success or failure of an analytics effort is not something you can determine in the moment. You really have to look over time and say, you think of it as an intervention, and is the post period of the intervention statistically different from the pre period, and can you show that addition of kind of analytic power actually added to a beneficial outcome. And I think that monitoring and paying attention, rather than just saying, okay, well, we're done with that one, let's move on to the next. Kind of keeping tabs on your past projects, monitoring, incrementally improving them. I think Sam Mackay, my boss, is a huge supporter of the idea that kind of what he calls the 90% rule, which is don't aim for perfection on a project, that at about 90%, get it out there, get it in front of the users and start testing and gathering data. And that if you spend all your time trying to polish it up to 100%, you're never going to release anything. And that sometimes that 90% is good enough to launch. And then from that, you can gather data to improve it that last 10%. But, don't try to just do that on your own. Get it out there, and you want to make sure that it's good enough so that you don't lose credibility with your users. But, I think that I've seen more and more the really top implementers of, data within organizations are willing to roll out something that's not perfect, but that they're going to use their user resources and their testing ability to gather and improve and continue to push that forward rather than just holding it until they they feel perfect about it, because you never get to that point. And so that's something for me that was a personal lesson. I'm kind of perfectionist at heart, and Sam would often for me say, pencil down, the report is ready, let's put it out. And that was a very good lesson learned for me.
So organizations too can learn from that. What other takeouts can you talk about or tip?
I think when you were talking before about, centers of excellence, I think that's a huge plus. I think in an organization, if you can really develop a robust center of excellence where you've got, developers and users and managers all participating, regularly and sharing best practices, running internal seminars, where you're proposing new ideas, where you're vetting, potential approaches, where you're celebrating successes, kind of doing case studies on things that worked. I think even doing case studies on things that didn't work, being honest about that. I think that is hugely beneficial. And I remember there was a podcast that Sam did with the head of analytics at Truist Bank, and I can't remember his name at the moment, but it's on our website, and it's available for if you follow the Analytic Mind podcast, which is one that we do at Enterprise DNA. It's one of the early episodes, and this guy had developed an incredibly robust center of excellence within his organization and talked about kind of what it took to do that and the resources that it took to maintain that and grow it. And I found that one to be, remarkably instructive in terms of, how you can not only kind of build out projects that serve a really valuable purpose, but then you can grow the people around those projects and continue to advance their knowledge and kind of take advantage of, kind of the internal communication and team processes to kind of bring everybody up to a higher skill and knowledge level of, data literacy. And so I think, those examples where people have successfully implemented, really strong centers of excellence, I think that's a big way to grow the value of analytics within your organization.
I mean, that's one great way that you can actually improve on the values to get a center of excellence where there's some level of coordination. I think you spoke consistently about governance and consistency throughout the organization and having incremental steps to ensure that you would gradually improve in the organization. And you've made a case of the Truist Bank and how they managed to build a very great center of excellence. I have a case in point in EcoBank in Ghana and in Africa. They've built a very robust center of excellence. in-house, and it's working very fine, like you said. The key that I'm getting from all this is, at the end of the day, always seek the user's interest and the business interest, and you are about 80% done if your interest is on the business user and the business itself. Once that is clear, you realize that you will drop a lot of things that are not important. They may just be nice to have. You may have seen it in challenges, like you said. However, they may not be useful in real life to your organization. So you just take it one day at a time with the users in mind and build it incrementally. I think that, is there any other thing that you'd want us to learn?
Yeah, one other thing that's kind of a big theme that I'm always harping on is, I think data analysts sometimes get wrong the idea of being, what it means to be objective and unbiased. And when I was overseeing analysts, I wanted their reports and their analysis to have a perspective. You know, tell me, you're the one who spent the last days, weeks, and months, elbow deep in this data. You're the one who can tell me what it means. And if I get a report that's just a bunch of visuals and slicers, it doesn't mean anything to me. It's like my reaction is, if I want to do the analysis myself, I would have. That when I get a report as a client, I want to see the perspective of the analyst. What do they think this data means? What do they think the takeaways are? What are the key findings? What are the actionable insights in that analysis? And I don't want it to be at the end of the report. It's not a novel. It's not something I need to work my way through. I want to see that right up front in the report, and then have the ability to drill down and explore those conclusions at the level of detail that I want, not at the level of detail that the analyst is going to walk me through. And so, I think when we talk about being unbiased and being objective, what that means is you're driven by the data, that your conclusions are supported not by your opinions or your preconceptions, but that they're supported by the analytical work you've done. It doesn't mean you don't have strong opinions. And I feel a data analyst without a strong opinion at the end of an analysis is not worth anything. That's not going to deliver me as the client something of value. That I want somebody who says, these are the three things this data is really telling me. And here's what I think the implications of that are. And here's why I think that. And here's the data that backs up those conclusions. And I think that's a common mistake I see, particularly among new analysts, is their reports are what I call agnostic, which is they don't seem to believe anything. It's kind of exploratory. And I think there's a place for exploratory analysis, but in terms of addressing business problems and being responsive to a client, you don't want to hand somebody just an exploratory analysis. And I think that's a common mistake I see, and one that I wanted to highlight, because I think you should always be asking yourself, is this giving, the question I always ask myself is, if I were the client paying for this report, how would I feel about that? Does it provide me enough in value that if I have to sign the invoice for that report, I feel good about what I've just spent doing that?
Wow. So at the end of the day, the value comes to how much use this report or this analysis is to the end user. In the end, that it makes his work easier by your report or by your analysis.
Yeah, it makes their work easier, or it makes their decisions better, or it clarifies, priorities. Or, I was talking to somebody today, and, he was talking about a report that he produced that improved forecasts by 2%. And it doesn't sound like a lot, but that is an enormous improvement in a large company that basically does, huge business based on forecasts. That 2% improvement can be multiple millions of dollars. And, kind of making that point and showing, here's the conclusion is we can improve your forecast by 2%. Then it's like, here's what that 2% actually means. And here's how we got that 2% improvement. That is a report that is immensely valuable to me as a client. And I think it highlights that if all you're doing is showing options and showing, here are 10 forecast techniques and here are the potential outcomes of those, that doesn't tell me enough. But it's when you can say, okay, making the right choices here, here's the improvement we'll get, here's the implication of that, and here's the proof of where that comes from. That's a home run.
That's pretty much. I think recently there was a challenge, and it was by Microsoft, or I think, and one of the Microsoft employees partook of it. I think it's the Marvin Airline Challenge, and one of the Microsoft employees took part of it, and in the end, she was like, at the end of the day, you are looking at what should the company do. That is the most insightful thing you can do for the organization. Not showing them summary, like you're saying, exploratory analytics on what is in the data. That is not what you are paid for. At the end of the day, we want to improve our customer satisfaction as an airline. And you've analyzed the data. So can you tell us which areas we can focus on so that it will drive this amount of satisfaction? Simpliciter.
Yeah.
If it's just 2 lines and you can tell me clearly by the data where I need to focus to get the maximum benefit, then I'm okay. I do not care about all the other things that, like you're saying, then later I can request for evidence to that, to actually appreciate what you've done. But at the end of the day, there is always an objective, a business objective, be it financial, be it sales. The question would be, how best can I improve the situation? Or how can I best make the best out of this? If your analytics cannot answer these and bring down the business value, like you're saying, then you are not worth your salt. You just described just 100 million rows of data to us, and that is not useful at all.
Right. Exactly. And that's where I think the planning process comes in. And I think sometimes there's an eagerness to just jump into the data and start analyzing. And I think, as somebody who loves analyzing data, I feel that pull myself sometimes. And you have to pull yourself back and say, okay, there's an analytics planning stage that's so critical, which is, what are the questions this is going to answer? What is the data that I need to answer those questions? Do I have that data? Is the data of sufficient quality? If it's not of sufficient quality, is there a way for me to clean it or to augment it? Once I get that data, how am I going to test it to make sure that what I'm seeing are real results and not just artifacts of the sample I've drawn? There's a tremendous amount of rigorous analytical planning that I think needs to happen before you do one speck of data analysis. And I think sometimes there's a tendency to just jump in and start analyzing, and it's kind of like we'll figure it out as we go. And
I get you.
it's kind of like the old joke, we're lost, but we're making good time. And I think for that analysis to really be of maximum value, you need to know where you're going before you start on the journey.
I think there's a quote that says there's nothing as useless as doing efficiently what shouldn't have been done at all.
Right. Right.
So sometimes I think that's what we do as analysts, that we try to efficiently do something that we shouldn't have done at all. So it's of no use. I mean, you just summarizing rules of data does not cut it for the business. get to the end of it, that there's something that the business user is looking for. Wow. All right. Any other thing that you'd want to touch on?
No, I think that's I think kind of thinking on my experience, I think those are I guess the big takeaways, unless you've got specific questions on something you think I might have missed.
I believe that it's been extensive, like you always say. You know, what I've learned from you is not about the amount of things that you do. It is about doing the few things and doing it consistently and incrementally improving on it. That is how you drive value across the organization. You're not going to change the organization with one dashboard or one report.
Right.
Make sure that you start incrementally, get your champions, get a governance framework, get a reporting framework, be consistent at it and be diligent at it, like stepwise. That's better in driving value. And at the end of the day, always consider what needs to be done, not what has to be done. And once you satisfy these, you'll be able to drive value with your Power BI. Thank you very much, Brian. It's been a very long chat, and I've learned a lot, and I hope to get in touch more often.
Likewise, I always enjoy our conversations and appreciate the opportunity to be on, and just thank you for what you do with the community. That I feel like the conversations that you have and the contributions that you make and kind of exploring these issues with people all around the world and across the community, I feel like adds a tremendous amount to the storehouse of knowledge. So very much appreciate, and I'm honored to be a part of that.
So viewers, we've come to the end of part 2, but never the end of our lives with Brian. Hopefully we'll get in touch with him once again that a topic comes up. Subscribe to my channel, follow Brian on LinkedIn, and follow Enterprise DNA, and catch you some other time with another issue. Have a great day.